He asked me to put my name on a $4 million loan 2 weeks before the grand opening of his building. I said yes before I even finished reading the paperwork because I trusted him. 3 days later, my banking app sent me a notification about a joint account I didn't remember opening, an account that had been quietly moving money to a woman named Elise Kwan for the past 14 months. I didn't confront him. I didn't cry. I closed the notification, made myself a cup of tea, and opened my laptop, and I started reading everything I could find about the man I was about to legally bind myself to for the next 15 years. My name is Naomi Reese. I'm 29. And this is the story of how I found out the man I loved had built a second life on paper he thought I'd never look at closely enough to notice. I met Marcus Delane at a property investors mixer 6 years ago, back when he was still renting a desk in a shared office and pitching renderings of buildings that didn't exist yet. He was magnetic in the way ambitious men often are. He made you feel like you were the only stable thing in a life built entirely on risk. I was an interior design consultant then, hired to stage his very first show unit, a 2-bedroom model apartment in a building that hadn't even topped out. He told me later that he fell for me the moment I rearranged his lobby furniture without asking permission. I fell for him somewhere between his third failed pitch and his first successful one, when I watched him absorb rejection without letting it touch the way he treated the people around him, the contractors, the leasing agents, me. For 6 years, I watched him build an empire out of almost nothing. Delane Property Group went from a 2-person operation running out of a shared co-working space to a firm with 40 employees and 3 completed towers across the city. I was there for all of it, the sleepless nights before zoning approvals, the champagne after the first building topped out, the quiet dinners where he'd talk through deals with me because he said my instincts were sharper than his lawyers. I helped him pick paint colors and I helped him pick investors, and somewhere along the way those two things stopped feeling different from each other. We moved in together 4 years ago, into a converted loft. He was proud of the way other men are proud of a car. He raised the idea of marriage more than once, always after this next project closes, always once things settle. I let it settle into background noise, because the rest of it, the partnership, the trust, the way he'd call me first with good news and bad, before his own mother, before his business partner, felt like enough. I told myself that a man who let you see him afraid wasn't a man who was hiding anything from you. I believed that for 6 years. I was wrong about the mechanism, if not entirely wrong about the fear. The 4th tower, the Ashworth, was supposed to be the one that put him in a different league entirely. 62 stories, mixed residential and retail, financed through a consortium of investors he'd spent 2 years courting one dinner at a time. But 6 weeks before the scheduled opening, one of his lead investors, a firm called Callaway Partners, pulled out over a liquidity dispute that had nothing to do with Marcus and everything to do with their own fund troubles. Marcus came home that night pale in a way I'd never seen him, not even during the worst of the second tower's permitting delays. He needed a bridge loan for $1 million to cover the gap until a replacement investor, a man named Aldous Hendricks, could get his own funds cleared and wired. His personal credit was already leveraged across 2 other active projects. The banks wouldn't extend him anything close to that number on his own signature alone. He needed a co-signer with clean, unencumbered credit and liquid personal assets that weren't already tied up in his business. "It's 30 days, Nomi," he said, sitting across from me at our kitchen island with the loan documents fanned out like a peace offering, like something he was almost embarrassed to be asking for. 30 days until Hendricks' money clears and I pay it off in full. You'd never even see the debt hit your name in any real way. I wouldn't ask if I had another option. You know I wouldn't. I want to be honest about something, because I think it matters to the rest of this story. I said yes because I loved him, but I also said yes because some part of me had been waiting 6 years for him to need me the way I had needed him to need me. 6 years of being the woman who staged his buildings and organized his investor dinners and never once had her own name on anything that mattered. I signed the documents that night in the kitchen under the light above the stove, and I didn't read past page 4. I have thought about that moment more times than I can count since. The trouble started the way trouble like this usually starts, small and easy to explain away, if you're the kind of person who wants an explanation more than you want the truth. 3 days after I signed, my phone buzzed with a notification from an account monitoring app I'd set up years earlier and mostly forgotten about. A leftover habit from a period after my identity had been compromised in a data breach when I was 24. It flagged any transaction over $2,000 across any account linked to my social security number. The notification named an account I didn't recognize, a business checking account under Delane Quan Holdings, and it flagged an outgoing transfer of $11,000. I sat with that for a long moment, the phone screen still lit in my hand. Delane Quan. Not Delane Property Group. Not anything I'd ever once heard him mention, not in 6 years of dinner table talk about every deal he'd ever touched. And my name wasn't supposed to be anywhere near an account I hadn't opened. I could have asked him about it that night, over the pasta he was making, humming to himself the way he did when a deal was finally moving in his favor. I almost did. But something in me, the same instinct that had made me good at reading investors before he ever signed with them, the instinct he used to say was sharper than his lawyers, told me to wait. To look first and ask questions only once I already knew the answers. So instead of asking, I opened the banking portal on my laptop after he'd gone to sleep, and I traced the account back through the fraud alert system, using the same access that had flagged it in the first place. It took me nearly 2 hours to find what I wasn't supposed to find. My social security number had been used 8 months earlier as a secondary guarantor on a business line of credit for Delane Quan Holdings LLC, a company registered in a state I'd never lived in, one I had never once heard him mention, filed under a signature that was close enough to mine to pass a casual glance, but wasn't mine at all. The loop in the R was wrong. I'd know my own handwriting anywhere. Someone had forged my signature onto a business entity I'd never agreed to be part of. And the name listed as managing partner alongside his was Elise Quan. I didn't sleep that night. I lay next to Marcus while he breathed evenly beside me, dreaming, I assumed, about ribbon cuttings and skyline photographs, and I said nothing, and inside my chest something had gone very still and very cold. The way water goes still right before it freezes all the way through. I remember staring at the ceiling and thinking, very clearly, the way you think a thought you know you'll return to for years. Whatever this is, I am not going to find out the rest of it by asking him first. The next morning, once he'd left for a site inspection at 7, I did what 6 years of watching him build deals had quietly trained me to do without ever meaning to be trained. I built a file. I started with Elise Quan. It didn't take long. She had a modest but polished public design portfolio, listed as a boutique commercial architect, 31 years old, based 2 states away in a smaller city Marcus traveled to for supplier meetings, roughly once a month for the past 2 years. I remembered those trips. I remembered packing his garment bag for some of them. Her portfolio included renderings for a mixed-use development called Quan Tower, a modest 6-story project that, when I cross-referenced the public filing dates against my own memory of his travel calendar, had broken ground 14 months ago, almost exactly when the joint account had started quietly moving money. I widened the search. LLC filings are public record if you know where to look, and I knew precisely where to look, because I had spent years sitting beside him at our kitchen island while he filed exactly this kind of paperwork for his own projects, asking me what I thought of names, of structures, of which partner should be listed where. Delane Quan Holdings had been registered 19 months ago. Managing partners, Marcus Delane and Elise Quan. Registered agent address, an apartment complex in her city, Unit 14C. I found the lease for 14C next, buried 3 layers deep in a property records search I only knew how to run because he'd taught me, half joking, that everything's findable if you're patient and a little bit ruthless. It had been signed 11 months ago, jointly, under both their names, with a move-in date that lined up almost exactly with one of his supplier trips, the one where he texted me a photo of a hotel room ceiling and said he missed our bed. I found a photo of the 2 of them next, cached in a browser history sync between our shared cloud storage account, the kind of accidental digital leftover that happens when 2 devices are logged into the same family plan for convenience. It was a rooftop, string lights, a folding table with a cake on it. A housewarming, it looked like. Elise Kwan laughing at something out of frame, his arm around her waist in a way he had never once let me photograph in public in 6 years of careful, camera-shy privacy about our own relationship. He didn't like PDA, he'd always told me. He didn't like being photographed off guard. I had believed that was a fact about him. It turned out to be a fact about me. By the end of that first day, I understood the shape of it, even if I didn't yet understand all the edges. He had spent 14 months building an entire second life, a company, an apartment, a business partnership that may or may not have also been something else, using money that ran, in part, through accounts now legally tethered to my own social security number. And in 6 weeks, my credit was going to be the thing propping up the tower that would make his name in the city, while somewhere else, another woman's name was already on the paperwork for the life he was actually planning to disappear into. I didn't confront him. I want to be very clear about why, because I think this is the part people misunderstand most about women like me when they hear stories like this one. It wasn't fear. It was arithmetic. If I confronted him that week, before the bridge loan fully closed and before I'd secured my own position, I would be a woman standing in a kitchen yelling at a man who had a team of lawyers, for $1 million of my personal exposure sitting on paper with my forged signature already in it, and 2 years of quiet practice lined to my face without so much as a flicker. I needed to be standing somewhere else, legally and financially, before I said a single word to him about what I knew. Love had made me patient with him for 6 years. This was the first time I let that patience work entirely for me instead of for him. On the 4th night, I almost broke that resolve. I called my sister, Dana, and told her I needed to talk, and when she picked up I found I couldn't say any of it out loud, not yet, not while it still felt unreal enough that saying it might make it more true than I could handle. Instead, I asked her a strange, roundabout question, whether she thought people could really live 2 full lives at once without one of them cracking under the weight of the other. She laughed and said something about how every man she'd ever dated could barely manage one life, let alone 2, and I laughed too, and then I hung up and sat on the bathroom floor for 20 minutes with the water running so Marcus wouldn't hear anything through the door. That was the only time I let myself feel it before I'd finished building the file. After that night, I put it away and worked. There was a second piece of evidence that mattered more than I expected it to, one I almost missed. Buried in the shared cloud account, in a folder Marcus used for architectural renderings he sent to contractors, was a set of interior mood boards for a residential unit soft neutrals of a reading nook, 2 names in the file metadata under collaborators, his and hers. It wasn't Quan Tower. It wasn't a business project at all. It was a home. Dated 7 months ago, updated as recently as 3 weeks before I found the notification. I sat with that file open for a long time. A business partnership can be explained away as ambition, as opportunity, as a version of the truth a person tells themselves to make the deception feel smaller than it is. A shared home, with a reading nook picked out in a color she probably chose and he probably approved, is not ambition. It has a different name. So for the next 11 days, I became someone I don't think Marcus ever looked at closely enough to recognize, even though I was sleeping next to him every night, laughing at his jokes at dinner, still helping him pick the flower arrangements for the Ashworth's launch party like nothing in the world had changed. I met with a financial attorney, a sharp, unhurried woman named Priya Osei, under the cover story of reviewing the co-sign terms more carefully before the renewal date, which wasn't even technically a lie. She confirmed, within our first meeting, what I already suspected, because the forged guarantor signature on Delane Quan Holdings had never been properly notarized or authenticated against my actual signature on file. I had strong legal grounds both to dispute that filing entirely and, more urgently, to renegotiate or withdraw from the terms of the Ashworth Bridge loan before it fully closed, protecting my own exposure completely, if I moved quickly and quietly enough. I met with my own accountant next, a woman I'd used for years for the design consultancy I ran quietly on the side, a small but steady business Marcus knew about only in the vaguest terms, the way you know about a hobby someone else has. Over those 11 days, I moved every liquid asset I had, assets he knew existed, but had never once asked to see the full accounting of, into accounts he had no visibility into whatsoever. I want to say I planned that years in advance. I didn't. Some instinct in me had simply always kept one door that was only mine, never fully merged, never fully shared, even while I merged almost everything else about my life into his. I hadn't understood, until that week, why I'd kept it that way. I understood it perfectly now. Around day 7, Marcus started to notice something was different, though not the right thing. He asked, twice, if I was feeling okay, if the wedding that wasn't yet a wedding talk was stressing me out, if I needed him to slow down on the Ashworth timeline so we could actually talk about us once the launch was behind him. I told him I was fine, that I was just tired from coordinating the party logistics, and I watched him accept that answer the way he accepted every convenient answer I had ever given him, without a second look, because it had never once occurred to him that I might be the one keeping something from him. That was, I think, the exact moment I understood how completely he had underestimated me for 6 straight years, not out of malice, but out of habit. He had simply never needed to imagine me as someone capable of finding him out, because I had never once given him a reason to. I also spent part of those 11 days quietly documenting his travel pattern against Quan Tower's construction milestones and against 3 separate credit card statements I still had shared access to, purely as a formality, from an account we'd opened together in our second year for household expenses. Charges at restaurants in her city on nights. He told me he was stuck in back-to-back site walkthroughs. A florist, twice. A jeweler, once, for an amount I made myself look at directly instead of looking away from, though the item purchased was never itemized on the statement, only the total. I didn't know, and still don't fully know, what that particular charge became. I decided I didn't need to know in order to finish what I'd already started. I called Aldous Hendrick's office directly on the 9th day. The replacement investor Marcus was counting on to clear the bridge loan within the month, under the entirely legitimate pretense of coordinating final logistics for the Ashworth launch party, which was, technically, still part of my job as the person who had staged and styled every one of his properties for 6 years running. In that call, delivered as casually and warmly as I could manage, somewhere near the end, almost as an afterthought, I mentioned that I'd recently come across some paperwork that made me wonder whether Delane Property Group's secondary holdings were as clean as they appeared, and that I assumed his due diligence team had already looked into all of it, given how thorough Hendrick's firm was known to be. I said it exactly once. I said it vaguely enough that it could never be traced back to malice, only to an offhand comment from a woman helping plan a party. And then I let a man whose entire career had been built on smelling risk from 3 rooms away do the rest of the work himself. The launch party for the Ashworth was 2 weeks after I found that first notification. Marcus wanted me on his arm at the top of the building, 62 stories up, in front of investors, city officials, and a wall of press photographers who had been invited to document what was, on paper, the crowning achievement of his career. I wore the dress he'd picked out for me from a boutique he'd called ahead to reserve. I let him introduce me to Hendricks himself, in person for the first time, as the woman who makes all of this possible, which, by that point, had become truer in ways Marcus did not understand and would not understand until it was far too late to matter. I watched Elise Kwan walk into that party at exactly 8:40 that evening, on the arm of one of Marcus's junior partners, who had, I later learned, been told she was a design consultant from a satellite project, here for cross-promotional purposes. I watched Marcus's face when he saw her across the room, not shock, not guilt, nothing so honest as either of those. Just a brief, practiced recalibration, the same expression he gave a difficult investor right before he pivoted a pitch mid-sentence, without missing a beat. He had spent 2 years believing he'd built 2 lives with clean, soundproof walls between them. He had never once imagined the walls could see each other, or that the woman standing quietly at the edge of every room he'd ever worked had been the one holding both blueprints the whole time. I didn't make a scene. I didn't need to. 2 days earlier, Hendricks had quietly informed Marcus's finance team that he was pausing the release of the replacement funding, pending further review of Delane Property Group's holding structure. A review triggered by the exact irregularity I had mentioned so lightly on that phone call, now sitting in a due diligence file with my forged signature attached as Exhibit 1. Marcus didn't know that yet. Standing on his own rooftop, 62 stories above a city, he believed he'd already won. I found a quiet moment near the elevator bank, away from the photographers and the string quartet and the wall of glass showing the whole skyline lit up gold, and I told him calmly, evenly, the way you'd mention a minor scheduling conflict, that I wouldn't be signing the renewal paperwork due at the end of the month, that I had already retained counsel regarding the unauthorized use of my signature on Delane Quan Holdings, and that Hendricks' team had, entirely independently of anything I'd done, found reason of their own to delay. I told him I hoped Elise was enjoying 14C. I told him I'd already forwarded the lease documents and the filing records to my attorney as supporting evidence, in case he was tempted to argue any of it was a misunderstanding. I watched something collapse behind his eyes that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with math. He understood, in that moment, faster than I expected of him, exactly how much of his empire had been quietly resting, this entire time, on a foundation only I had the power to remove. I moved out 3 weeks later, into an apartment I'd secured with money he never knew I had, in a building he'd once mocked as fine for someone starting out. The bridge loan collapsed entirely within the month, once Hendricks' due diligence team formally surfaced the forged guarantor filing and flagged it to their compliance department. 2 of his other longtime investors followed Hendricks out the door within the quarter, spooked by the same irregularity once it became impossible to keep quiet. The Ashworth still opened, technically, on schedule. The ribbon got cut. The photographers got their shots. But under a restructured ownership stake that left Marcus holding a minority position in the very building that was supposed to make his name in the city for the next 20 years. Elise Quan, from what I later heard through people who still occasionally talked to me, dissolved Delane Quan Holdings 4 months after that night and went back to running her own firm alone, her name no longer tangled up with his on anything. I don't know what she knew or didn't know about the rest of it, and after a while I stopped needing to know. Some doors you're allowed to just close. I used what I'd learned in those 11 days about structuring, about due diligence, about exactly how thin the walls really are between a man's public story and his private one, no matter how carefully he thinks he's built them, to finally build something with my name on it and nobody else's. I started my own design and development consultancy 8 months after I left, using a network I'd spent 6 quiet years earning in rooms Marcus had always assumed I was only there to decorate. My first solo project was a boutique residential renovation 2 blocks from the Ashworth. I can see the tower from my office window if I choose to look. Most days, I don't need to. People ask me sometimes, when they hear this story, whether I regret not confronting him the moment I got that first notification, whether I wish I'd screamed, or thrown something, or made him feel, right there in our kitchen, exactly what I felt reading his forged signature sitting next to a version of my own name. I don't. Confrontation would have given him something to manage, and men like Marcus are never better at anything than they are at managing a woman's anger in real time. Silence gave me 11 days to make sure that when the walls finally came down, they came down on his terms, using his own paperwork, in front of the exact people whose respect he had spent his entire career chasing, and that I would be the only person left standing in the room who had known the whole shape of it from the beginning. He built an empire on being the one person in every room who always knew everything first. It turns out he was never quite as alone in that room as he thought, and neither, in the end, was I. Sometimes, late at night, I think about the version of me who almost didn't check that notification, who was tired, who trusted him enough to swipe it away and ask about it over breakfast instead, half asleep, half convinced it was nothing. That version of me signs the renewal paperwork at the end of the month. That version of me finds out about 14C from a stranger at a party, or a lawyer's letter, or not at all. I think about her sometimes, not with pity exactly, but with a kind of quiet gratitude that I wasn't her that particular week, even though most weeks before that one, I probably was. Dana asked me, months later, once I'd finally told her everything, whether I thought Marcus ever loved me at all. Underneath the 2 years of parallel paperwork and the housewarming photo and the reading nook someone else picked the color for. I told her I genuinely didn't know, and that I'd stopped needing the answer to matter as much as I once thought it would. Whatever he felt for me, it had never once been enough to make him tell me the truth when the truth was inconvenient to his timeline. That, in the end, was the only fact I needed to build the rest of my life around. I still run into people from that world occasionally, investors, contractors, a leasing agent who once worked the Ashworth's ground floor retail space and now manages a building 2 blocks from my own office. They tell me things sometimes, unprompted, the way people do when they think a story has a natural audience. That Marcus's 5th project stalled out entirely last year when a new round of investors ran a background check thorough enough to surface the Delane Quan filing dispute, still technically unresolved in a slow-moving civil court somewhere. That he sold his stake in the Ashworth's retail podium 18 months ago to cover a legal bill. That he still tells people, when asked, that the whole thing was a misunderstanding involving an overzealous business partner, a story that gets a little thinner every time someone who actually knows the paperwork happens to be in the room. I don't correct him when I hear that second-hand version of events. I don't need to. The paperwork already corrected him for me, in rooms far more important to him than any room I ever stood in beside him. I built my own name in this city instead, on my own signature, verified and notarized and entirely, finally mine.